Hey guys, this is John. So this morning I was over at Starbucks, my usual spot, sipping a tall iced coffee. Starbucks, please hit me up for that sponsorship, by the way. And I received an email from a student, and he had just played a rapid game on chess.com, 15 plus 10 game. He was facing a higher rated opponent, 1734. My student's rating is 1593. And my student said he was pretty happy with how he played this game, but he had some questions as to how to improve his thought process in the end game. And as soon as I saw this game, I realized it was pretty instructional. So I asked my student if I could share it with my YouTube audience, and fortunately he agreed. So let's have a look at this game. We're going to ignore the first half of the game because it's not too relevant to our discussion, but I do like how my student developed in the opening. He got his light square bishop outside of the pawn chain here in this closed opening. And then there was a pawn break in the center. So my student decided to play e5. And there were some trades. We won't debate the merits of these moves, but lots of trades. The queens came off the board. And on move 21 here for white made a critical decision and a good decision. White played bishop takes d5, trading this light square bishop for the knight on d5. And after c takes b5, we can see the contours of the battle. And it should be apparent that white is better here. White has a very nicely outposted knight on d4, blockading this isolated queen's pawn. This is a chronic weakness for black in the position. Black is going to be suffering here. However, this is a position where a player who has good technique as black will generally know how to defend this and can put up quite a bit of resistance. And with best play, I am skeptical as to whether white can win this, but it will be a long slog. So let's go forward. There was a standoff on the c-file for a little bit. White started bringing his king over. And very soon, all the rooks disappeared from the board. So rook takes c1, king takes c1. So now we're in a pure bishop versus knight with 6 pawns each. My student makes his way to the center with his king. And white starts grabbing a little bit of space here and plays h4. And my student played g6. White now played f4, which is probably not the best move, but grabbing more space. My student played b5. White played a3. And now my student played f5. And f5, while in some sense logical looking because it does clamp down on the e4, this is the decisive mistake of the game. And if you want to pause your video and figure out why this is the decisive mistake, feel free to do that now. Okay, so this allows white to simplify into a winning king and pawn ending. So this knight could have captured the bishop on a number of different occasions for the past several moves, but had there been a capture earlier, black would have had the option of playing f takes e6. But now, after knight takes e6, king takes e6, white can play king d4. And even though black is able to stop the king from infiltrating to e5 or c5 for a moment, white can out-tempo black. And indeed, his higher-rated opponent correctly played b4 here. Excellent understanding of the tempi situation. And black is going to run out of moves. My student played h5, and white played e3. And we can see that black has exhausted his good pawn moves here. These would just lose a pawn. So he has to give way with his king. And he played king c6, and this allows the infiltration of the king to e5. He tried a5 just out of desperation here, because if he moves his king, he's going to lose d5, and he can lose pawns on either wing. White can go after either side of the board after that, or even push e4, but most likely continue picking off pawns with his king. So my student tried a5, and white actually didn't even bother taking it, just played king here, kind of demonstrating his dominance of the position. And very soon my student threw in the towel because white was promoting this d-pawn. So obviously I cued you into this position, and we figured out that f5 was the losing move. But what was the real cause of the loss for black? And again, my student was asking about how can he improve his thought process here. So it's easy enough to look at this, and especially with the help of a computer, isolate like, okay, yeah, we see that white is winning here because black runs out of tempi. But what was the root cause of this even happening in the first place? Well, we know that this endgame was a tough defense for black because, again, white has this beautiful knight. Black's bishop doesn't have a lot of targets. Even though sometimes a bishop can be favorable against a knight when there's pawns on both sides of the board, this is not one of these positions. This is a setup with the IQP where the side with the bishop is going to be notoriously suffering. Now, let's look at a game from chess history, because the thing that cued me into thinking that this would be very instructional is a game played by Capablanca against Salo Flor way back in 1935 in Moscow. So Capablanca was playing black in this game. And once again, we're going to fly through the opening. It's not really relevant. It was a Queen's Gambit declined. Very soon you will see that this game shapes up extremely similar to my student's game. And in fact, there's a swap of all the rooks. And what do we have? It's the exact same material distribution. So a light square bishop against a nicely outposted knight on d4, 6 pawns each. The pawn structure is slightly different, but the themes are all the same. And now let's compare what my student did with what Capablanca did. So Capablanca, one of the most phenomenal endgame players of all time. Capablanca and Carlsen are like neck and neck by most people's metrics. Certainly for his time, Capablanca was far, far ahead of his peers. So, all right, black brings the king to the center. And again, white is refraining from capturing on e6 because black could take with the pawn. And that helps black a lot if that ever happens, because black can advance the pawn to e5. White may never even get the king to d4 if this is the case. So Flor decides to play king c3, and Capablanca plays b6. b6, Flor plays f4. Capablanca withdraws the bishop here, bishop to d7. It is somewhat dominated by the knight, but on the other hand, you could say the bishop is dominating the knight because it's controlling some of its forward squares with the help of pawns, but making sure that knight can't jump anywhere devastating. And also preventing knight takes e6, so black doesn't have to think about the transition to a pawn endgame for now. Okay, white played knight f3. And watch how black is arranging his pawns. So Capablanca plays f6. So he covers e5 and he covers g5. Step forward another move, so Flor puts the king on d4. This is a useful square for white to pivot his pieces in and out of. He can try to exert pressure on d5 by maneuvering this knight to, say, c3. And also, maybe in the future, threaten to bring the king in. But because Capablanca has already played his pawns to f6 and b6, black's not going to have the problem that my student did in that other game, where the king, in some simplified scenario, can get into these squares. And he takes this even further now, so he plays a5. So black's pawns are doing a great job of complementing his bishop. He has the pawns on the opposite color of his lone bishop. And that's, if you take away anything from this video, that's something to think about. So usually when you have a lone bishop, you should try to arrange your pawns on the opposite color of that bishop so you don't impede it. And you can shore up the other color complex because there's a decent chance the other color complex may be weak. So black is taking care to control the dark squares with the bishop nicely controlling the light squares. Harmonious. If you get too committed to one color complex, that's when bad things can happen. And we'll go forward again. White played knight d2. Black is waiting. White does bring the knight around to c3. But Capablanca waits again. He just has this d-pawn reinforced. h6 again, so really taking this theme to the extreme. And now Capablanca did actually decide to play h5. And this is a move that was criticized. Mikhail Shereshevsky, who's a notorious endgame expert, he wrote a book on endgame strategy. He said this move was unnecessary, and I do agree. It looks like black can just wait here, actually, with king d6, and it should be fine. Possibly Capablanca was worried about white maneuvering his knight around to h4 and then trying to come into g6, according to Shereshevsky. But yeah, it was not necessary to play that. King d6 would have been fine. And if white plays something like knight e2, I think bishop g4, and if knight g1, well, this knight is kind of corralled now. So black can play something like bishop d1, and I don't think this knight is going anywhere. Black should be totally fine here. So h5, I would say, the one questionable decision by Capablanca in this endgame. Game continues, b4, there's a trade of pawns. Black plays the king back to d6. Flor goes b5. And now, kind of by virtue of having played h5, Capablanca does play g6, but importantly, he's keeping this pawn on f6. That's pretty critical, controlling the e5 and the g5 squares. And to Floor's credit, he finds an interesting way to try to keep the game going because despite that slight h5 inaccuracy, the position is still very drawish. So Floor plays f5 here, trying to deflect the bishop. So if bishop takes f5, he can take on d5 and target these two pawns. So Capablanca correctly plays g takes f5. Now he's up a pawn, but his structure is a mess. Every single one of these pawns are isolated. And Floor tries to bring the knight around to f4, but Capablanca very quick to create counterplay here. So he attacks that pawn on a light square. Bishop b5. Floor plays knight f4, attacking d5 and h5. Capablanca, for the moment, decides to guard the h-pawn, probably so white doesn't capture h5 and achieve a breakaway h-pawn here. And now knight takes d5, bishop takes b5. White has his choice of which pawn to take. He decides to take on b6. But now we're in a pretty simplified position, 3 pawns each. Black still does have a slightly worse endgame, but Capablanca had enough activity here to salvage the draw. He activates his bishop, kind of like I was advocating in that other line. Notice, nice move here, bishop f1. Again, controlling the squares that the knight could go to. And Floor plays knight d3, and Capablanca at this point correctly simplifies to a king and pawns endgame. And this turned out to be a draw. Again, we can analyze this in greater detail, but yeah, the game was drawn actually right here after king e5. If white were to play h4, just as an example, king d5, king f4, king e6, holding the pawn on f5, and white can't make further progress. For example, e4 is a trade, f5 check, king here, and notice again, black controlling these squares, and white doesn't have a spare pawn move to put black in zugzwang to try to infiltrate to one of these squares. So despite that inaccuracy with h5, this is a very good model for how to play these positions and how to think about playing with a lone bishop. There are some cases where you do actually want to put your pawns on the same color as your lone bishop, but by and large, you should be looking to create this harmonious situation where you have your pawns arranged opposite, so you can actually fight back on that other color complex. That's good technique. And once again, compare it to my student's game, where he had this position, and yes, he was very solid on the light squares, but he was not controlling e5 and c5 permanently enough. And by some nice play here with the pawns b4, white put my student in zugzwang, and the game was soon over. So, hope that was helpful, how to think of situations involving an outposted knight versus a bishop with an isolated pawn, how to arrange your pawns when you have a lone bishop, and also the importance of studying the classics. Again, that Capablanca game played way back in 1935. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll be back again soon with another video. Bye, guys.